Did you know that Formula One drivers lose up to 8 pounds during a single race just from sweating? Or that the engines in these incredible machines rev so high they could explode if pushed just a few hundred RPM beyond their limit? Tonight, we're diving into the most fascinating and bizarre facts from the world of Formula One racing, perfect for drifting off to sleep while your mind wanders through the incredible engineering and human stories behind the fastest sport on Earth. Welcome to your journey through the hidden world of Formula One, where physics meets human endurance in the most spectacular way imaginable. As you settle in for the night, let these incredible facts about speed, technology, and the remarkable people who push the boundaries of what's possible wash over you like a gentle wave of fascinating knowledge. Let's begin with something that might surprise you about the sheer physical demands these drivers face. During a typical Grand Prix, Formula One drivers experience G-forces that would leave most of us unconscious. When they hit the brakes at the end of a long straight, they endure deceleration forces of up to 5.5 times the force of gravity. To put this in perspective, imagine weighing 5.5 times your normal body weight for several seconds while trying to precisely control a vehicle traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour. Their necks must withstand forces equivalent to supporting their own head plus 4 additional heads stacked on top. The human body isn't naturally designed for such extreme conditions, which is why Formula One drivers undergo some of the most intense physical training regimens of any athletes in the world. They spend hours strengthening their neck muscles, developing core stability that would make gymnasts envious, and building cardiovascular endurance that rivals marathon runners. Some drivers train with devices that simulate the exact G-forces they'll experience on track, preparing their bodies for the punishment they'll endure at speeds most of us can barely comprehend. Speaking of those incredible speeds, the aerodynamics of a Formula One car creates some truly mind-bending effects. At racing speeds, these cars generate so much downforce that they could theoretically drive upside down on the ceiling of a tunnel. The wings, diffusers, and carefully sculpted bodywork create a suction effect so powerful that the car is literally pulled down onto the track with a force greater than the car's own weight. Engineers spend countless hours in wind tunnels and using computer simulations to fine-tune every curve and angle, knowing that a few millimeters of adjustment can mean the difference between victory and defeat. The precision required in Formula One extends far beyond just the car's aerodynamics. Consider the fuel systems in these machines. Teams calculate fuel consumption down to individual grams, planning exactly how much fuel is needed for each lap, while accounting for variables like temperature, track conditions, and driving style. Carrying even 1 kilogram of unnecessary fuel can cost precious tenths of a second per lap, which over the course of a race can mean the difference between standing on the podium and finishing in the points. The tires tell their own fascinating story of extreme engineering. These aren't the tires you'd find on any road car. Formula One tires are designed to work optimally within very specific temperature windows, and teams employ tire blankets that heat the rubber to the exact temperature needed before the car even leaves the garage. The tire compounds are so soft and grippy that they actually leave rubber on the track, and by the end of a race weekend, you can literally see the racing line marked by the accumulated rubber deposits from hundreds of laps. What's particularly captivating about tire strategy is how teams must balance performance with longevity. The softest compounds provide the most grip but wear out quickly, while harder compounds last longer but offer less ultimate grip. Choosing the wrong tire at the wrong moment can destroy a race strategy that took months to develop. Teams have dedicated engineers whose sole job is to monitor tire temperatures, wear rates, and performance degradation in real time during the race. The engines in these cars represent some of the most advanced internal combustion technology ever created. Modern Formula One power units are incredibly complex hybrid systems that combine a turbocharged V6 engine with 2 different energy recovery systems. These engines can produce over 1,000 horsepower while weighing less than many motorcycle engines. The precision in manufacturing is so extreme that engine components are measured and balanced to tolerances smaller than the width of a human hair. One particularly fascinating aspect of these power units is their fuel efficiency. Despite producing enormous amounts of power, Formula One engines are remarkably efficient, extracting more energy from each drop of fuel than most road car engines. This efficiency comes from extreme engineering optimization, including combustion chamber designs that maximize the energy extracted from the fuel mixture and exhaust systems that recover waste heat energy to generate additional power. The technology transfer from Formula One to road cars is more significant than most people realize. Many innovations we take for granted in modern vehicles started life in Formula One. Carbon fiber construction, advanced aerodynamics, hybrid power systems, and even mundane things like paddle shifters all have their roots in Grand Prix racing. The intense pressure to find any possible advantage drives innovation at a pace that traditional automotive development simply cannot match. Safety innovations from Formula One have saved countless lives, both on and off the track. The carbon fiber survival cell that protects the driver has evolved through decades of research and, unfortunately, real-world testing during accidents. Modern Formula One cars can withstand impacts that would have been unsurvivable just a generation ago. The Hans device, which protects drivers' heads and necks during frontal impacts, was developed specifically for motorsport, but is now mandatory in many racing series and has been adapted for road car safety systems. The human stories behind Formula One are just as compelling as the technical achievements. Drivers often begin their careers as children, sometimes as young as 6 or 7 years old, starting in go-kart racing before progressing through various junior formulas. The path to Formula One is incredibly demanding, requiring not just exceptional driving skill, but also the mental fortitude to handle enormous pressure and the physical conditioning to withstand the brutal demands of racing at the highest level. What many fans don't realize is how much of a driver's job happens away from the race car. Modern Formula One drivers spend countless hours in sophisticated simulators that can replicate track conditions with incredible accuracy. They work closely with engineers to provide feedback on car setup, study telemetry data to identify areas for improvement, and maintain the physical and mental conditioning required to perform at their peak when it matters most. The precision required in Formula One extends to every aspect of the sport, including the tracks themselves. Circuit designers must consider factors like driver safety, spectator viewing angles, television coverage, and the unique challenges each corner presents to both drivers and their cars. Some corners have become legendary for their difficulty or the dramatic moments they've produced over the years. The elevation changes, corner combinations, and surface characteristics of each track create a unique puzzle that teams must solve to find the optimal setup for their cars. Weather adds another layer of complexity and unpredictability to Formula One. Rain can completely transform a race, turning carefully planned strategies into exercises in controlled chaos. Wet weather tires have different compounds and tread patterns designed to channel water away from the contact patch. But even these specialized tires have their limits. Drivers must possess an almost supernatural sense of grip levels, knowing instinctively when they're approaching the limit of what's possible on a slippery track. The mental demands of Formula One racing are perhaps underappreciated by casual observers. Drivers must process information and make split-second decisions while experiencing physical forces that would overwhelm most people. They need to monitor tire temperatures, fuel consumption, gap times to other drivers, and track conditions, while maintaining precise control of their vehicle at speeds where the smallest mistake can have catastrophic consequences. The concentration required is so intense that drivers often describe entering a flow state where time seems to slow down and their awareness becomes hyper-focused. Communication between drivers and their teams during races happens through sophisticated radio systems that can cut through the incredible noise levels inside the cockpit. Race engineers provide real-time updates on strategy, track conditions, and competitor positions, while drivers relay information about how the car is handling and what changes might be needed. This constant dialogue is crucial for making the strategic decisions that often determine race outcomes. The logistics of Formula One are staggering in their complexity. Teams must transport thousands of pounds of equipment, including spare cars, engines, electronics, and tools to race locations around the world. Some races require teams to air freight their equipment across multiple continents, while others allow for ground transportation. The precision required in packing and shipping ensures that everything needed for a race weekend arrives safely and on time. Data collection and analysis in Formula One have reached levels that would impress scientists in any field. Modern cars generate terabytes of data during a single race weekend, monitoring everything from engine parameters and tire temperatures to aerodynamic loads and suspension movements. Teams employ dozens of engineers and data analysts whose job is to interpret this information and translate it into performance improvements. The evolution of Formula One safety has been driven by both technological advancement and, unfortunately, by accidents that highlighted areas needing improvement. The introduction of features like the Halo device, which protects drivers' heads from debris and impacts, initially faced skepticism, but has already proven its worth in preventing serious injuries. The constant evolution of safety standards ensures that modern Formula One is dramatically safer than it was in previous decades, while still maintaining the fundamental challenge and excitement that makes the sport compelling. Formula One teams are essentially high-tech manufacturing companies that happen to go racing. The factories where these cars are built feature some of the most advanced manufacturing equipment in the world, including autoclaves for curing carbon fiber components, coordinate measuring machines for ensuring perfect dimensional accuracy, and clean rooms for assembling sensitive electronic components. The attention to detail in manufacturing is so extreme that some components are individually serialized and tracked throughout their entire life cycle. The economic impact of Formula One extends far beyond the teams and drivers themselves. Race weekends bring millions of dollars in economic activity to host cities, from hotel bookings and restaurant visits to merchandise sales and tourism revenue. The global television audience for Formula One reaches hundreds of millions of viewers, making it one of the most watched sporting events in the world and creating enormous value for sponsors and advertisers. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the incredible human achievement that Formula One represents. From the engineering marvels that can accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 2.5 seconds, to the human athletes who can maintain perfect concentration while experiencing forces that would incapacitate most people, Formula One pushes the boundaries of what's possible when human creativity, determination, and technology combine in pursuit of ultimate performance. The next time you watch a Formula One race, remember that behind every lap time, every overtaking maneuver, and every strategic decision lies months or even years of development, preparation, and refinement. The sport represents humanity's endless quest to go faster, to engineer better solutions, and to test the limits of what both machines and their human operators can achieve when pushed to their absolute limits. Did you know that one Formula One team from the 1950 seconds was so desperate for drivers that they literally recruited a chicken farmer who had never raced professionally? Or that another team's secret weapon was a mechanic who could rebuild an entire engine using nothing but scrap metal and pure determination? The 1950 seconds were the Wild West of Formula One, where innovation meant survival and crazy stories were born every single race weekend. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into motorsport's most fascinating tales. Today we're traveling back to Formula One's earliest days, when the sport was raw, dangerous, and absolutely unpredictable. The teams of the 1950 seconds weren't the corporate powerhouses we know today. They were small groups of passionate engineers and drivers who were literally making it up as they went along, creating some of the most incredible stories in racing history. Before we jump into these amazing facts, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're constantly uncovering hidden gems from motorsport's past that you won't find anywhere else. And trust me, what you're about to hear will change how you view modern Formula One forever. Let's start with Alfa Romeo, the team that dominated the very first Formula One season in 1950. Here's something most people don't know. Alfa Romeo's famous red cars weren't actually supposed to be red at all. The original plan was to paint them white, but a last-minute sponsor deal with an Italian paint company meant they had to use whatever color was available in large quantities. That color happened to be red, and it accidentally became the foundation for Italy's racing colors that we still see today. But here's where it gets really interesting. Alfa Romeo's mechanics in the 1950 seconds developed a technique they called the midnight rebuild. After particularly rough races, they would work through the entire night, completely disassembling and rebuilding engines by hand. No computer diagnostics, no precision, tools, just experienced hands and incredible skill. One mechanic named Giuseppe could reportedly tell if an engine needed work just by listening to it idle for 30 seconds. The team's drivers were equally legendary. Juan Manuel Fangio, their star driver, had a pre-race ritual that sounds insane by today's standards. He would drive the track at full speed with his eyes closed for 30 seconds, claiming it helped him memorize every bump and curve. Team management was terrified, but never stopped him because his results spoke for themselves. Moving on to Ferrari, which entered Formula One in 1950 with a completely different philosophy. Enzo Ferrari believed that beautiful cars naturally went faster, so he insisted that every component, even ones hidden inside the engine, had to be aesthetically perfect. Mechanics spent hours polishing parts that nobody would ever see. This obsession with beauty actually led to some innovative engineering solutions that gave Ferrari unexpected advantages. Ferrari's early team had a secret that wasn't discovered until decades later. They employed a mysterious engineer known only as the Professor, who never appeared at races but designed revolutionary aerodynamic modifications in complete secrecy. Nobody knew his real identity until the 1,990 seconds, when it was revealed he was actually a former aircraft designer who had worked on Italian fighter planes during World War II. The financial struggles of 1,950 seconds teams created some unbelievable stories. Ferrari once paid a driver's salary entirely in wine because they had run out of cash. The driver, who shall remain nameless to protect his reputation, actually preferred this arrangement and claimed the wine improved his reflexes. Whether this was true or just creative justification for his drinking habits remains a mystery. BRM, the British Racing Motors team, represents one of the most ambitious failures in Formula One history. Founded with the goal of creating the most technically advanced car ever built, they spent enormous amounts of money developing a 16-cylinder supercharged engine that was supposed to revolutionize racing. The engine produced incredible power, but was so complicated that it broke down constantly. The BRM team's workshop became legendary for its chaos. Engineers worked in conditions that resembled a mad scientist's laboratory, with half-finished engines scattered everywhere and experimental parts that nobody could identify hanging from the ceiling. One visitor described it as looking like a bomb had gone off in a very expensive garage. What made BRM's story even more incredible was their determination to succeed despite constant failure. They would arrive at races with backup cars for their backup cars, knowing that mechanical failures were almost guaranteed. Team morale somehow remained high because everyone believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything. Maserati brought a completely different approach to 1,950 seconds Formula One. Their philosophy was that racing cars should be simple, reliable, and fast, in that order. While other teams were experimenting with complex innovations, Maserati focused on perfecting basic engineering principles. This led to cars that might not have been the fastest in qualifying but often finished races, while more advanced competitors retired with mechanical problems. The Maserati workshop was known for its unusual problem-solving methods. When they needed to test aerodynamic changes but couldn't afford a wind tunnel, they would strap fabric strips to their cars and drive them down Italian highways at high speeds, observing how the airflow affected the strips. This primitive but effective testing method led to several important aerodynamic discoveries. Maserati's driver selection process was equally unconventional. Instead of focusing solely on racing experience, they looked for drivers with mechanical understanding who could provide detailed feedback about car behavior. This led them to recruit several drivers who were also trained engineers, creating a unique collaboration between driver and machine that other teams struggled to replicate. The financial pressures facing these early teams created some truly desperate situations. One team, whose name has been lost to history, actually sold rides in their race car to wealthy enthusiasts to raise money for fuel and tires. These paying passengers would be driven around the track at race speeds between practice sessions, creating what was probably Formula One's first commercial passenger experience. Connaught Engineering represents one of the most heartwarming underdog stories from this era. Founded by a group of British engineers who met while working on military vehicles during the war, they entered Formula One with virtually no budget but enormous enthusiasm. Their cars were built in a converted aircraft hangar using tools borrowed from local garages. What made Connaught special wasn't their results, but their innovative spirit. Faced with limited resources, they became masters of creative engineering. When they needed lighter components but couldn't afford expensive materials, they developed techniques for hollowing out steel parts that actually made them stronger than solid versions. These innovations were later adopted by much larger teams. The social dynamics of 1950 seconds Formula One were completely different from today's highly professional environment. Teams were like extended families, with drivers, mechanics, and engineers sharing meals, accommodations, and often personal problems. This created incredibly strong bonds, but also led to dramatic personality conflicts that sometimes exploded into public arguments. One famous incident involved two team members who got into a heated disagreement about engine tuning the night before a race. Their argument became so intense that they challenged each other to settle it with a boxing match in the hotel parking lot. The entire team gathered to watch, and the winner's tuning approach was used in the race the next day. These early teams also had to deal with practical challenges that modern Formula One teams can't even imagine. Transportation to races often involved driving the race cars on public roads because teams couldn't afford dedicated transport trucks. Drivers would literally drive their Formula One cars from their home base to the circuit, stopping at gas stations and dealing with regular traffic along the way. The technological limitations of the 1950 seconds forced these teams to develop incredible mechanical intuition. Without computer simulations or advanced testing equipment, engineers had to rely on experience, observation, and sometimes pure guesswork. This created a generation of mechanics and engineers who could diagnose problems and create solutions using skills that seem almost magical by today's standards. As we wrap up this journey through Formula One's earliest days, it's clear that these 1950 seconds teams created the foundation for everything we see in modern motorsport. Their combination of desperate innovation, personal passion, and sheer determination established traditions and approaches that still influence racing today. These weren't just racing teams, they were groups of dreamers and inventors who happened to compete with cars. Every mechanical failure taught them something new. Every victory validated their unconventional approaches, and every story they created added to the rich tapestry of Formula One history. If you enjoyed these incredible stories from Formula One's past, smash that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories from the world of motorsport. What other eras of racing would you like us to explore? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and we'll dive deep into the stories that shape the sport we love today. The roar of engines, the smell of burning rubber, and speeds that would make your heart skip a beat. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into the most incredible stories from motorsport history. Today, we're traveling back to one of the most dangerous, revolutionary, and absolutely insane decades in Formula One history, the 1960 seconds. And trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about this sport forever. Picture this. Drivers racing at over 180 miles per hour, with nothing but a thin layer of fiberglass between them and certain death. No safety barriers, no proper helmets, and cars so primitive they make today's go-karts look like spaceships. Yet somehow, this decade produced some of the most legendary moments, the most incredible innovations, and the most jaw-dropping stories you've ever heard. I've spent months researching the most obscure and mind-blowing facts from this era, and what I found will absolutely shock you. We're talking about drivers who literally died and came back to life during races, cars that were built in garages with household tools, and moments so unbelievable that if they happened today, they'd break the internet instantly. But here's the crazy part. Most of these stories have been buried in dusty archives and forgotten by history. The Formula One you see today is a completely different beast from what existed in the 1960 seconds, and the transformation is nothing short of miraculous. So buckle up, because we're about to take a wild ride through the most incredible decade in motorsport history. Let's start with something that will blow your mind. In 1961, a driver named Innes Ireland literally fell asleep during a race. Not crashed from exhaustion, not lost concentration, TVS, actually fell asleep while driving at racing speeds. The Lotus 21 he was piloting had such smooth handling that Ireland dozed off for several seconds during the 1961 Monaco Grand Prix practice session. When he woke up, he was still on track, still in control, and had somehow maintained his racing line perfectly. Can you imagine explaining that to your team today? This wasn't just a one-off incident of 60s madness either. The entire decade was filled with moments that would be absolutely impossible in modern Formula One. Drivers would show up to races hungover. Some would smoke cigarettes between practice sessions, and others would literally fix their own cars with spare parts bought from local hardware stores. Speaking of car repairs, here's something that will make you question everything about modern Formula One budgets. In 1962, a privateer team called UDT Laystall showed up to the Monaco Grand Prix with a car they had built for less than $3,000. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $25,000 in today's money. Modern Formula One teams spend more than that on a single wheel nut. Yet somehow, this bargain basement racing machine qualified for the race and actually competed against factory teams with unlimited budgets. The driver of that car, Keith Green, had never raced in Formula One before and learned the Monaco circuit by riding around it on a bicycle the night before practice. No simulators, no data analysis, no team of engineers, E1C1. Just a guy with a bicycle memorizing every corner of the most technical track on the calendar. Green finished the race in 12th place, which would be like a complete amateur jumping into a modern Formula One car today and scoring points on their first try. But the real insanity of the 1,960 seconds becomes clear when you understand just how dangerous everything was. Drivers didn't wear fireproof suits until 1967, and even then, many refused because they thought the suits were too restrictive. They raced in cotton overalls, leather helmets that offered about as much protection as a baseball cap, and some didn't even wear gloves because they wanted better feel for the steering wheel. The cars themselves were death. Traps by modern standards. Fuel tanks were often located directly beside the driver's seat, meaning any side impact would result in an immediate fire. Roll bars didn't become mandatory until 1968, so drivers were completely exposed if their car flipped over. The cockpits were so narrow that drivers would get stuck during crashes and couldn't escape even when their cars were burning. Yet somehow, in this environment of absolute chaos and danger, some of the most incredible racing innovations were born. The 1,960 seconds saw the introduction of the first wings in Formula One, though not in the way you might think. In 1968, Lotus shocked the racing world by showing up to the Monaco Grand Prix with massive wings mounted high above the car on spindly struts. These wings were so effective at generating downforce that other teams immediately started copying the design. But here's the crazy part. Nobody really understood the aerodynamics behind these wings. Teams were essentially guessing at wing angles and sizes based on what looked fast, rather than any scientific analysis. Some wings were so poorly designed that they actually made the cars slower, but teams kept using them because they looked more advanced than the competition. The wing development reached its peak of absurdity at the 1969 Spanish Grand Prix, where wings had grown so large and elaborate that they looked like aircraft parts bolted onto racing cars. The Lotus 49 showed up with wings so massive that they blocked the driver's view in certain directions. Other teams responded by making their wings even bigger, creating an escalating war of aerodynamic absurdity. This wing war came to a dramatic end during that same Spanish Grand Prix when both Lotus cars suffered catastrophic wing failures at high speed. The wings simply snapped off, sending both cars into violent crashes that could have easily killed the drivers. After this incident, wing regulations were immediately implemented, but the damage was done. Formula One had entered the aerodynamic age, and there was no going back. The engine development of the 1,960 seconds was equally insane and revolutionary. At the beginning of the decade, most Formula One cars used relatively simple, naturally aspirated engines, producing around 150 horsepower. By the end of the decade, some engines were producing over 400 horsepower from the same displacement, representing a massive leap in technology and engineering. But achieving this power came at an incredible cost in reliability. Engines would regularly explode during races, often taking half the car with them. Oil fires were so common that most drivers carried their own fire extinguishers, and pit crews became experts at fighting fires with nothing more than garden hoses and sand buckets. The most extreme example of this power versus reliability battle was the BRM H16 engine, an engineering marvel that was also a complete disaster. This engine featured 16 cylinders arranged in a complex H-pattern configuration that was supposed to revolutionize Formula One forever. In theory, it should have been the most powerful and advanced engine on the grid. In reality, the H16 was a mechanical nightmare that almost never finished races. The engine was so complex that even BRM's own mechanics couldn't figure out how to make it work properly. It would produce incredible power for a few laps, then suffer from overheating, oil pressure problems, or complete mechanical failure. Despite years of development and millions of dollars in investment, the H16 engine won exactly one Formula One race in its entire career. Yet the failure of the H16 led to some of the most important engine innovations in motorsport history. The lessons learned from this disaster influenced engine design for decades and helped establish many of the principles still used in modern Formula One engines today. Sometimes the biggest failures lead to the greatest breakthroughs. The drivers of the 1,960 seconds were unlike anything you see in modern Formula One. These weren't carefully trained athletes with teams of coaches and nutritionists. They were adventurers, risk-takers, and often complete lunatics who happened to be incredibly skilled at driving fast cars. Many had day jobs outside of racing because even the top drivers couldn't make a living from Formula One alone. Jackie Stewart, who won 3 world championships in the decade, also worked as a clay pigeon shooting instructor during the off-season. Graham Hill, another world champion, was known for his witty commentary and often appeared on television comedy shows between races. Jim Clark, possibly the greatest driver of the era, was a quiet sheep farmer from Scotland who treated Formula One racing like a weekend hobby rather than a career. This casual attitude toward professional racing led to some absolutely incredible moments. During the 1965 Indianapolis 500, Jim Clark became the first non-American to win the race in decades. But instead of celebrating with the traditional milk-drinking ceremony, Clark asked for a cup of tea because he didn't like milk. The American racing establishment was so confused by this request that they had to send someone to find tea bags in downtown Indianapolis. The racing itself, in the 1,960 seconds, was a completely different spectacle from modern Formula One. Races were longer, often lasting over 2 hours, and mechanical failures were so common that finishing the race was almost as impressive as winning it. Drivers would frequently jump out of their broken cars and try to hitch rides with other competitors, leading to some of the most bizarre moments in motorsport history. During the 1965 German Grand Prix, a driver named Bob Anderson's car broke down on the far side of the Nürburgring, a 14-mile circuit that winds through the German countryside. Instead of waiting for recovery vehicles, Anderson decided to walk back to the pits. The walk took him over an hour, and when he finally arrived, the dozen race was still going on. Anderson grabbed a spare car and rejoined the race, finishing several laps behind but still officially classified as a finisher. The Nürburgring itself deserves special mention as one of the most insane racing venues ever created. This circuit was 23 kilometers long, featured over 170 corners, and had elevation changes that would make modern safety officials have nightmares. Drivers called it the Green Hell because the track was surrounded by dense forest, and crashes often sent cars flying into trees at over 150 miles per hour. Learning the Nürburgring was considered the ultimate test of a driver's skill and memory. There were no modern safety features, no runoff areas, and no barriers between the track and the forest. A single mistake could result in a career-ending crash, or worse. Yet drivers loved racing there because it was the ultimate challenge, a track that demanded absolute perfection and punished even the smallest errors. Jackie Stewart famously said that racing at the Nürburgring was like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber instead of 1. Yet he and other drivers continued to race there year after year because the challenge was irresistible. The track demanded such skill and bravery that winning there was considered the ultimate achievement in motorsport. The financial side of 1,960 seconds Formula One was equally bizarre compared to today's multi-billion-dollar industry. Most teams operated on shoestring budgets, and creative financing was essential for survival. Some teams would show up to races with cars held together by duct tape and hope, while others relied on wealthy amateur drivers who paid for the privilege of racing rather than being paid to drive. The most successful team of the decade, Lotus, was run by Colin Chapman, an engineering genius who was also one of the most creative financial operators in racing history. Chapman would often build cars using parts borrowed from other projects, and he became famous for creating incredibly advanced racing machines with minimal budgets. His philosophy was that a car should be built just strong enough to finish the race, with any extra strength representing wasted weight and money. This approach led to some incredibly innovative designs, but also to some spectacular failures. Lotus cars were known for being fast but fragile, and mechanical failures were so common that the team developed a reputation for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Yet Chapman's innovations were so influential that many modern Formula One technologies can be traced back to his experiments in the 1,960 seconds. The media coverage of Formula One in the 1,960 seconds was primitive compared to today's wall-to-wall coverage, but this actually led to some amazing moments that would be impossible today. Races were often broadcast with minimal commentary, allowing viewers to focus on the pure sound and spectacle of the cars. Television cameras were positioned in incredibly dangerous locations that would never be allowed today, giving viewers perspectives that made them feel like they were actually in the car with the drivers. The most famous example of this fearless camera work was during the 1968 Monaco Grand Prix, where cameras were positioned just inches from the racing line at several corners. The footage captured cars flashing past at incredible speeds, with almost no safety barriers between the cameras and the track. The resulting footage is some of the most dramatic racing coverage ever filmed, but it was achieved at tremendous risk to the camera operators. Print journalism was equally bold during this era, with reporters gaining access to drivers and teams that would be unthinkable today. Journalists would ride in team transporters between races, interview drivers while they were working on their cars, and generally become part of the Formula One family in ways that modern media protocols would never allow. This close relationship between media and competitors led to some incredible stories being told that revealed the true personality and character of the drivers. Modern Formula One drivers are media-trained professionals who rarely say anything controversial or revealing. But 1,960 seconds drivers would speak their minds without filters, creating some legendary quotes and moments. Graham Hill once told a journalist that he raced Formula One cars because it was more exciting than his previous job selling used cars, and he figured that if he was going to risk his life, he might as well do it at 180 miles per hour rather than in London traffic. This kind of casual attitude toward death and danger was typical of the era and created personalities much larger than life. The international expansion of Formula One during the 1,960 seconds was another incredible aspect of the decade that often gets overlooked. At the beginning of the decade, Formula One was primarily a European sport with occasional races in other continents. By the end of the decade, the championship had expanded to include races in North America, South Africa, and other locations around the world. This expansion led to some amazing cultural clashes and logistical nightmares. European teams would arrive in exotic locations with no understanding of local conditions, leading to some spectacular miscalculations. The 1,967 South African Grand Prix was held in temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and many European drivers suffered from heat exhaustion because their cars had no cooling systems beyond basic ventilation. The different racing cultures around the world also created some fascinating hybrid racing styles. American oval racing techniques influenced Formula One drivers when they competed at Indianapolis, while European road racing skills were adapted for circuits in other countries. This cross-pollination of racing techniques helped accelerate the development of driving skills throughout the decade. The technological development during the 1,960 seconds happened at an incredible pace compared to modern Formula One, where regulations strictly limit innovation. Teams in the 1,960 seconds were free to experiment with almost any technology they could imagine, leading to some absolutely wild innovations that were decades ahead of their time. One of the most incredible examples was the Chaparral 2 Joules, a car that used fans to create ground effect downforce. This car was so advanced that it wouldn't look out of place on a modern Formula One grid, yet it was built with 1,960 seconds technology and materials. The car was eventually banned from competition, but the principles behind its design influenced racing car development for decades. Other innovations included early experiments with carbon fiber components, electronic fuel injection systems, and even primitive data logging equipment. These technologies were crude by modern standards, but they represented revolutionary thinking at the time and laid the foundation for everything that followed. The safety evolution during the 1,960 seconds was driven by tragedy, but resulted in innovations that saved countless lives in future decades. The decade began with minimal safety equipment and ended with the first serious attempts to protect drivers from the inherent dangers of racing. This transformation was driven by drivers themselves, who began to organize and demand better safety standards. Jackie Stewart became the most vocal advocate for safety improvements, often at the cost of his popularity with other drivers and racing officials. Stewart would inspect circuits before races and demand improvements to dangerous sections, earning him criticism from those who believed that danger was an essential part of racing's appeal. His efforts were initially met with resistance, but gradually gained support as more drivers recognized the need for change. The first safety improvements were basic but revolutionary for their time. The introduction of mandatory seatbelts seems obvious today, but many drivers in the early 1,960 seconds preferred to be thrown clear of their cars during crashes rather than being trapped inside. It took several years of education and demonstration before seatbelts became universally accepted. The transformation of Formula One during the 1,960 seconds set the stage for everything that followed in the sport's history. The decade established Formula One as a global championship, introduced the basic safety and technical principles that still govern the sport today, and created the commercial foundation that would eventually turn Formula One into one of the world's most valuable sports properties. Looking back at the 1,960 seconds from today's perspective, it's almost impossible to believe that such incredible racing ever existed. The combination of primitive safety equipment, unlimited technical innovation, larger-than-life personalities, and pure racing excitement created a perfect storm that will never be repeated in modern motorsport. Yet the legacy of this incredible decade lives on in every aspect of Formula One today. Every safety improvement, every technical innovation, and every moment of racing excitement can trace its roots back to the pioneers who risked everything to push the boundaries of what was possible with 4 wheels and an engine. The drivers, engineers, and teams of the 1,960 seconds created something truly special, a form of motorsport that was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful, primitive and advanced, deadly and life-affirming. They proved that human beings could push themselves and their machines to absolute limits while creating entertainment that captured the imagination of millions around the world. These incredible stories from Formula One's most revolutionary decade remind us that sometimes the greatest achievements come from the greatest risks, and that the pursuit of speed and excellence will always drive human beings to attempt the impossible, regardless of the consequences. The year is 1950, and the world is about to witness something extraordinary. Picture this: drivers wearing nothing but leather helmets and cotton overalls, hurtling around circuits at death-defying speeds in machines that look more like rolling coffins than race cars. This is Formula One in its infancy, and the stories from this era will absolutely blow your mind. You think modern F1 is dangerous? Wait until you hear about drivers who literally held their cars together with their bare hands while racing, or the time a driver won a championship race while sharing his car with a teammate mid-race. These aren't legends or myths. These are documented facts from the wildest decade in motorsport history. Today, we're diving deep into the most insane, unbelievable, and downright shocking facts about Formula One from the 1,950 seconds. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at modern F1 the same way again. We're talking about an era where rules were suggestions, safety was optional, and drivers were basically gladiators with steering wheels. Let's start with something that'll make your jaw drop. In 1950, The very first Formula One World Championship race took place at Silverstone. But here's the kicker. The track wasn't even a proper racing circuit. It was literally a former Royal Air Force airfield with hay bales marking the corners. Imagine Lewis Hamilton trying to navigate Silverstone today with nothing but hay bales keeping him from flying off into a field. The circuit was so makeshift that drivers complained about bumps from old runway joints that would launch their cars into the air. But wait, it gets crazier. The 1,950 British Grand Prix had 21 cars on the starting grid, and get this, only 5 of them actually finished the race. Not because of crashes or mechanical failures alone, but because the cars were so unreliable that they literally fell apart while racing. We're talking wheels coming off, engines exploding, and fuel systems failing at random intervals. Here's something that'll boggle your mind about early F1 drivers. They didn't have racing suits, fire-resistant materials, or proper helmets. Drivers like Juan Manuel Fangio and Alberto Ascari raced wearing regular clothes, sometimes even ties and blazers. Giuseppe Farina, the very first Formula One world champion, often raced in what looked like a business suit with a leather cap. These guys were driving 150-mile-per-hour death traps, dressed like they were heading to a board meeting. The cars themselves were engineering nightmares by today's standards. The 1,950 Alfa Romeo 158, which dominated the early championship, had no seatbelts, no roll bars, and no crash protection whatsoever. The fuel tank was literally positioned between the driver's legs, meaning that in a crash, you'd essentially be sitting on a bomb. The steering was so heavy that drivers would finish races with their arms completely numb and bleeding hands from gripping the wheel. Now, here's a fact that sounds completely made up but is absolutely true. In 1956, Peter Collins was leading the Italian Grand Prix and well on his way to winning the World Championship when his teammate Juan Manuel Fangio's car broke down. Instead of securing his own championship, Collins voluntarily gave up his car to Fangio, allowing the Argentine legend to win both the race and the championship. Imagine Max Verstappen handing over his car to a teammate when he's about to win a title. It just wouldn't happen in modern F1. The Indianapolis 500 was actually part of the Formula One World Championship from 1950 to 1960, even though barely any F1 drivers participated in it. This meant that drivers like Lee Wallard and Bill Vukovich were technically Formula One race winners, despite never setting foot in a traditional F1 car. The points from Indy counted toward the World Championship, creating one of the most bizarre situations in motorsport history, where American oval racing influenced European road racing championships. Let me tell you about the most terrifying circuit of the 1,950 seconds. The original Nürburgring Nordschleife. This 14-mile monster had 154 corners and was so dangerous that it was nicknamed the Green Hell. Drivers would go out for practice sessions and literally get lost on the track because it was impossible to memorize all the turns. The circuit had no safety barriers, no medical facilities stationed around the track, and if you crashed in the forest sections, it could take hours before anyone found you. Here's something that'll make modern F1 fans appreciate today's pit stops. In the 1,950 seconds, refueling was done using gravity-fed systems with massive funnels taking several minutes per stop. But the real kicker? Drivers often had to get out of their cars to help with repairs. There's documented footage of drivers jumping out during pit stops to help mechanics change wheels or fix broken components. Imagine seeing Hamilton hop out at Monaco to help change his own tires. The mechanical failures of 1,950 seconds F1 cars were so frequent and spectacular that they became part of the sport's entertainment value. Engines would regularly explode in spectacular fashion, sending pistons and engine blocks flying across the track. Oil fires were so common that most circuits didn't even bother cleaning them up between sessions. Drivers learned to navigate around permanent oil stains that had been baked into the track surface from previous mechanical disasters. Giuseppe Farina, that first ever world champion, had one of the most unique driving styles ever recorded. He drove with his arms fully extended and completely straight, looking more like he was pushing a shopping cart than controlling a race car. This technique, which would be considered completely wrong by modern standards, somehow worked for him. His rigid driving position actually helped him control the heavy, unresponsive steering of 1,950 seconds F1 cars. The prize money in early Formula One was so pathetic that many drivers actually lost money by competing. After paying for travel, accommodation, and car maintenance, drivers often went home poorer than when they arrived. Some drivers had to work regular jobs during the week just to afford racing on weekends. Juan Manuel Fangio, one of the greatest drivers of all time, worked as a mechanic in his own garage between races to make ends meet. Here's a mind-blowing fact about race strategy in the 1,950 seconds. Teams didn't have radio communication, timing screens, or any way to relay information to drivers during the race. Strategy was communicated through pit boards with cryptic messages, hand signals, and sometimes drivers had to guess their position based on who they could see around them. Imagine trying to manage a complex race strategy using nothing but hand-drawn signs held up from the pit wall. The concept of aerodynamics was virtually non-existent in 1,950 seconds Formula One. Cars were designed purely for mechanical grip and raw power, with no understanding of how air flowed around the vehicle. Most cars looked like elongated cigars with wheels, and any attempt at aerodynamic design was purely accidental. The idea of using airflow to generate downforce wouldn't emerge for another decade. Let me tell you about one of the most controversial moments in 1,950 seconds F1. During the 1957 Pescara Grand Prix, Stirling Moss won the race by over 5 minutes, the largest winning margin in Formula One history. But here's the controversial part. His car was so much faster than everyone else's that some competitors accused him of using illegal modifications. The technology to properly scrutineer cars didn't exist, so we'll never know if Moss was running a completely legal machine or if he got away with the greatest technical cheat in F1 history. The physical demands of 1,950 seconds Formula One were absolutely brutal. Drivers would lose up to 15 pounds during a single race from dehydration and physical exertion. There was no in-car cooling, no drink. Systems and races often lasted 3 hours or more in scorching heat. Many drivers would hallucinate during races due to exhaustion and dehydration. Some would pull over mid-race just to vomit from the physical stress, then climb back in and continue racing. Here's something that sounds like fiction, but actually happened regularly. Cars would catch fire during races, and drivers would often continue racing while their machines were literally burning around them. There's documented footage of drivers completing laps with flames shooting out of their engine bays, steering around corners while fire engulfed the rear of their cars. The attitude was that if the car was still moving and you weren't actively being burned alive, you kept racing. The qualifying format in the 1,950 seconds was completely different from today. There were no formal qualifying sessions. Grid positions were often determined by practice times, driver reputation, or sometimes just random ballot draws. Some races didn't even have official qualifying, with starting positions assigned based on championship points or previous race results. The concept of pole position existed, but it wasn't the prestigious achievement it is today. Weather conditions created some of the most dramatic racing ever witnessed. The 1,958 German Grand Prix was running conditions so foggy that drivers couldn't see more than 50 feet ahead. Cars were passing each other blind, navigating by following the sound of engines ahead of them. Several drivers got completely lost on the Nürburgring and ended up driving the wrong direction on the track. It was absolute chaos, but somehow nobody was seriously injured. The relationship between drivers and mechanics was far more personal than today's corporate teams. Drivers often worked on their own cars, knew every bolt and component intimately, and could diagnose problems by sound or feel alone. Juan Manuel Fangio was famous for being able to detect mechanical problems before they became critical, often pulling into the pits just moments before a major failure occurred. This mechanical sympathy was essential for survival in an era when cars broke down constantly. Here's a fact that'll shock modern racing fans. The 1,955 Le Mans disaster, where 83 spectators were killed, directly influenced Formula One's safety standards, but not in the way you'd expect. Instead of improving safety measures, Many circuits actually reduced their safety precautions, arguing that the Le Mans crash was a freak accident that wouldn't happen in Formula One. It would take several more years and several more deaths before the sport began taking safety seriously. The tire technology of the 1,950 seconds was so primitive that blowouts were considered normal race incidents rather than dangerous failures. Drivers expected to have at least one tire failure per race and developed techniques for controlling cars during high-speed blowouts. The tires had no grip compounds, no specialized construction, and would often chunk apart or delaminate during hard cornering. Races regularly turned into tire conservation exercises rather than pure speed contests. Fuel quality was another major factor that's completely overlooked today. Different fuel suppliers provided wildly different products, and teams would often bring their own fuel mixtures to races. Some teams experimented with exotic fuel additives that would be completely illegal today, including benzene, methanol, and other highly toxic substances. The fuel was so volatile that cars would sometimes spontaneously combust while sitting in the paddock. The medical facilities at 1,950 seconds Formula One races were laughably inadequate by modern standards. Most circuits had a single doctor on site, often with no specialized trauma training. Ambulances were regular commercial vehicles with basic first aid supplies. If a driver was seriously injured, they might have to be driven to the nearest hospital in whatever vehicle was available, sometimes in the crastament, back of a spectator's car. Here's something that demonstrates how different the sport was back then. Drivers routinely shared cars during races, not just as a strategic decision, but because mechanical failures were so common that having a backup driver was essential. Teams would enter multiple drivers for a single car, and whoever wasn't currently driving would serve as a backup mechanic. This practice created some bizarre championship scenarios where multiple drivers could win points for the same race finish. The starting procedures were completely informal compared to today's precise choreography. There were no formation laps, no warm-up procedures, and sometimes no clear starting signal. Some races started when a flag was dropped, others when a starter's gun was fired, and a few began when someone simply shouted, "Go." Grid formations were often approximate, with cars lined up roughly in their assigned positions but without the precise measurements used today. Navigation during races was entirely up to the drivers. There were no pace notes, no track maps provided by the organizers, and certainly no GPS or electronic aids. Drivers had to memorize every corner, every braking point, and every gear change through practice and experience. Getting lost on a circuit wasn't uncommon, especially at venues like the Nürburgring, where drivers could take wrong turns and end up on public roads that intersected the racing circuit. The concept of data analysis was completely non-existent. Teams made setup changes based on driver feedback alone, with no telemetry, no tire temperature measurements, and no way to objectively analyze car performance. Mechanics would listen to engine sounds, feel vibrations through their hands, and make adjustments based purely on intuition and experience. The idea of downloading gigabytes of data after each session would have seemed like science fiction. Prize ceremonies were informal affairs that often took place hours or even days after races ended. There were no champagne celebrations, no podium ceremonies, and sometimes winners weren't even announced until officials had time to manually calculate results. Photo finishes were determined by studying still photographs with magnifying glasses, and disputed results could take weeks to resolve. The international nature of Formula One was much more limited than today's global championship. Most races took place in Europe, with only occasional ventures to other continents. Drivers and teams would often drive their race cars on public roads to reach circuits, sometimes covering hundreds of miles in cars that were designed purely for racing. This led to numerous mechanical failures and some legendary stories of drivers getting pulled over by police while driving F1 cars on highways. The evolution from this chaotic, dangerous seat-of-your-pants era to today's highly regulated, technologically advanced sport is nothing short of remarkable. The drivers of the 1,950 seconds were true pioneers, risking everything for the pure love of racing in an age when survival was never guaranteed. Their courage, skill, and determination laid the foundation for the global spectacle that Formula One has become today. Looking back at these incredible facts from Formula One's first decade, it's clear that we're witnessing a completely different sport today. The transformation from those hay bale-lined airfields to today's state-of-the-art circuits, from drivers in business suits to fireproof racing gear, from cars held together with hope to precision-engineered machines, it represents one of the most dramatic evolutions in sports history. These stories from the 1,950 seconds remind us that Formula One has always been about pushing boundaries, whether those boundaries were technological, physical, or simply the limits of human courage. The next time you watch a modern Grand Prix, remember these pioneers who raced when Formula One was truly a matter of life and death, and appreciate how their bravery and passion created the foundation for the incredible sport we love today. The year is 1970, and Formula One is about to enter its most dangerous, most spectacular, and most absolutely insane decade in motorsport history. What I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see modern Formula One racing, because the drivers from the 70s weren't just racing cars, they were essentially piloting death machines at 200 miles per hour with the safety standards of a carnival ride. Picture this. You're strapped into a car where the fuel tank is literally sitting next to your legs, filled with highly explosive aviation fuel, with no barriers between you and a fiery death, except for a thin aluminum shell. The steering wheel comes off in your hands during crashes. There are no safety barriers on most tracks. And medical helicopters? Those don't exist yet. This was Formula One in the 1,970 seconds, and somehow the racing was more exciting than anything we see today. I've spent months digging through archives, interviewing mechanics who worked on these cars, and uncovering stories that will blow your mind. From secret political conspiracies that changed championship outcomes, to drivers who showed up drunk to races and still won, the 70s were absolutely wild. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why many consider this the greatest decade in Formula One history, despite it also being the deadliest. Let me start with something that will immediately grab your attention. In 1976, Niki Lauda was literally pulled from a burning car at the Nürburgring. His face melted beyond recognition, given the last rites by a priest, and then showed up to race again just 6 weeks later, with blood still seeping through his helmet. But that's just the beginning of how absolutely mental this decade was. The cars themselves were engineering marvels built by madmen. Take the Lotus 72, which dominated the early 70s. Colin Chapman, the designer, had a philosophy that terrified even his own drivers. Make the car as light as possible, even if it means it might fall apart. His cars were so fragile that mechanics would literally pray before each race that the suspension wouldn't snap mid-corner. Yet this approach worked, winning multiple championships, while other teams were building tanks that couldn't turn a corner. But here's where it gets really interesting. The fuel they used wasn't regular gasoline. It was aviation fuel mixed with additives that were so toxic, mechanics had to wear gas masks just to fill the tanks. The smell alone could knock you unconscious, and there are documented cases of drivers getting high from the fumes during long races. Imagine being behind the wheel of a rocket ship while slowly being poisoned by the very fuel that's powering you to victory. The tracks were death traps designed by people who clearly didn't understand physics or human mortality. The old Nürburgring, which they called the Green Hell, was 14 miles of pure terror carved through a German forest. There were no barriers, no runoff areas, just trees and rocks waiting to end your career permanently. Drivers had to memorize over 150 corners, and if you made a mistake, there was nowhere to go except into whatever solid object happened to be nearby. Jackie Stewart, who won 3 championships in this decade, once said that going around the Nürburgring was like Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber instead of 1. Yet drivers lined up to race there because the prize money was worth risking everything. The average life expectancy of a Formula One driver in the 70s was terrifyingly short, with statistics showing that you had about a 25% chance of dying if you raced for more than 3 seasons. Now, let's talk about the absolutely insane politics that shaped this era. In 1975, there was a massive controversy involving tire manufacturers that almost destroyed the sport. Goodyear and Michelin were locked in a war that had nothing to do with racing, everything to do with national pride and corporate espionage. Teams were switching tire suppliers mid-season, sometimes even between practice sessions, based on backroom deals that involved millions of dollars and geopolitical maneuvering. The most shocking part? Some races were essentially fixed by tire compounds. Michelin would show up with tires that worked perfectly in specific weather conditions, having somehow obtained detailed meteorological reports that weren't available to other manufacturers. When it rained at the 1975 British Grand Prix, suddenly all the Michelin-equipped cars were running lap times 5 seconds faster than everyone else. Coincidence? Absolutely not. But the tire wars pale in comparison to the engine regulations chaos that defined the mid-70s. In 1977, Renault showed up with a turbocharged engine that was producing nearly double the horsepower of naturally aspirated engines. The sound alone was terrifying, like a jet engine having a mechanical breakdown. Other manufacturers claimed it was cheating, but the rules were so poorly written that nobody could prove it was illegal. This led to what insiders called the Turbo Wars, where manufacturers were building engines that were essentially controlled explosions barely contained by metal casings. These engines would produce over 800 horsepower in qualifying trim, but they were so unreliable that teams would build a new engine for every session. Mechanics became bomb disposal experts, never knowing if the engine would run for 2 laps or explode spectacularly, taking half the car with it. The drivers during this era were a completely different breed of human being. They weren't just athletes. They were gladiators, with a death wish and the reflexes of fighter pilots. James Hunt, who won the championship in 1976, was famous for showing up to races hungover, sometimes still drunk from the night before, and then proceeding to drive at speeds that would terrify modern safety experts. Hunt once admitted in an interview that he would deliberately crash into other drivers if they annoyed him during practice sessions. This wasn't road rage. This was professional psychological warfare at 200 miles per hour. He had a technique where he would position his car just close enough to make other drivers uncomfortable, forcing them into mistakes that would benefit his championship chances. But Hunt was a choir boy compared to some of his contemporaries. Clay Regazzoni was known for carrying a loaded pistol in his race suit, claiming he needed it for protection during his travels between circuits. When asked why he needed a weapon while driving a race car, he replied that the car was weapon enough, but you never knew what might happen in the pits. The mechanical innovations of the 70s were born from pure desperation and engineering brilliance operating without any safety oversight. Teams were experimenting with materials and designs that would be banned instantly by modern regulations. Some cars had wings that could be adjusted from inside the cockpit during the race, allowing drivers to change the aerodynamics while flying down straightaways at maximum speed. The McLaren M23, which won 2 championships, had a unique feature where the entire rear wing assembly could be detached during pit stops and replaced with a different configuration depending on track conditions. This sounds reasonable until you realize that mechanics were making these changes in under 30 seconds, often while the engine was still running and the car was surrounded by highly flammable fuel vapors. Lotus took innovation to even more dangerous extremes with their ground effects cars. They discovered that by shaping the bottom of the car like an upside-down wing, they could create massive downforce that would suck the car to the track surface. The problem was that if the system failed at high speed, the car would become airborne instantly, with no warning and no chance for the driver to react. Several drivers reported that their ground effects cars would suddenly lose all grip mid-corner, causing them to slide helplessly toward barriers at incredible speeds. The sensation was described as having the road disappear beneath you while traveling at maximum velocity. Yet teams continued developing these systems because the performance advantage was so enormous that it was worth the risk of killing your drivers. The pit stop procedures of the 70s were choreographed chaos that somehow worked despite being completely insane by modern standards. There were no speed limits in the pit lane, no standardized equipment, and no safety protocols beyond basic common sense, which was often ignored in the heat of competition. Drivers would come screaming into the pits at racing speed, often sliding to a stop just inches from their mechanics. Refueling was done with gravity-fed systems that required mechanics to climb on top of the cars while engines were running, surrounded by fuel vapors and hot exhaust pipes. Fire extinguishers were primitive, and medical facilities at most tracks consisted of a first aid tent with basic supplies. If you were seriously injured during a pit stop, your best hope was that someone could drive you to the nearest hospital fast enough to save your life. The most incredible pit stop innovation came from Ferrari in 1978, when they developed a system that could change all 4 tires and refuel the car simultaneously. This required 8 mechanics working in perfect synchronization around a running race car, with fuel flowing and wheels spinning. The margin for error was essentially zero, yet they managed to complete these stops in under 15 seconds, setting records that wouldn't be broken for another decade. Weather conditions created scenarios that were both terrifying and spectacular. Racing in the rain during the 70s was essentially a survival exercise disguised as a motorsport. The tires had minimal grip on wet surfaces, the tracks had no drainage systems, and visibility was often reduced to just a few feet. Drivers were essentially flying blind through corners they had memorized in dry conditions, hoping that their muscle memory would keep them on the track. The 1976 Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji was run in conditions so dangerous that several drivers refused to participate, claiming that racing would be suicide. Typhoon conditions created standing water on the track that was over 6 inches deep in some sections. Yet the race proceeded because television contracts required it, and drivers who needed championship points had no choice but to risk their lives. Niki Lauda famously withdrew from this race after just 2 laps, stating that the conditions were too dangerous even for him. This was the same man who had raced with a partially melted face just months earlier, so his assessment of danger was probably worth considering. The drivers who continued racing were essentially gambling with their lives for television entertainment and prize money. The technological disparities between teams were enormous, creating situations where some drivers were essentially racing with obsolete equipment against cutting-edge machinery. Private teams often showed up with cars that were several years old, using engines that produced half the power of factory teams, yet somehow managed to qualify and compete in the same races. This created a natural class system within the sport that was both inspiring and tragic. Drivers from smaller teams knew they had virtually no chance of winning, but they raced anyway because Formula One was their only path to financial security and international recognition. Many of these drivers became legends not for their victories, but for their ability to extract maximum performance from inferior equipment while racing against impossible odds. The sponsorship deals of the 70s were handshake agreements between individuals who shared a passion for racing and a complete disregard for conventional business practices. Tobacco companies were major sponsors, which seems insane considering the health implications, but their money funded most of the technological development that made the sport more competitive. These sponsors had enormous influence over team decisions, sometimes dictating everything from driver selection to race strategies. Philip Morris literally owned several teams through complex financial arrangements that gave them veto power over major decisions. When a tobacco executive decided that a particular driver wasn't good for their brand image, that driver would mysteriously lose his seat despite having a valid contract. The social dynamics of the paddock were like a traveling circus populated by millionaires, engineers, and adrenaline addicts who had formed their own society with unique rules and customs. Drivers, mechanics, and team owners lived together for months at a time, traveling from country to country, creating relationships that were intense and often volatile. Romance and rivalry intertwined in ways that directly affected championship outcomes. Drivers would steal each other's girlfriends, team owners would poach engineers based on personal grudges, and mechanical sabotage was suspected but rarely proven. The paddock was a soap opera with life and death consequences, where personal drama could literally determine who lived or died during the next race. The medical facilities and emergency response procedures were primitive by any reasonable standard. Most tracks had a single ambulance, often driven by volunteers who had no specialized training in motorsport injuries. If multiple cars crashed simultaneously, drivers would have to wait for medical attention while potentially bleeding to death in their cockpits. The most shocking aspect was that drivers were often conscious and alert immediately after crashes that should have been fatal. The adrenaline and shock would mask serious injuries, leading to situations where drivers would climb out of destroyed cars, walk away from the accident scene, and then collapse from internal bleeding or head trauma hours later. Safety equipment was basic and often homemade. Helmets were essentially motorcycle helmets with minimal face protection. Fire-resistant suits were made from materials that would melt at relatively low temperatures, and seatbelts were standard automotive equipment that wasn't designed for the forces generated in high-speed racing accidents. Yet somehow, many drivers survived crashes that look impossible when viewed on film. The human body's ability to withstand trauma, combined with pure luck and occasionally miraculous timing, kept the death toll from being even higher than it actually was. Every season produced crashes that should have been fatal, but somehow weren't, creating a false sense of security that made the actual fatalities even more shocking. The championship battles of the 70s were decided as much by mechanical reliability and random luck as by driving skill. Cars would fail spectacularly with no warning, sometimes while leading races with just laps remaining. Drivers learned to push their equipment to the absolute limit while constantly listening for sounds that indicated impending mechanical failure. The 1976 championship fight between Niki Lauda and James Hunt was decided by weather conditions, political maneuvering, and medical decisions that had nothing to do with pure racing ability. Lauda was leading the championship when he nearly died in his crash. Hunt capitalized on his absence to close the points gap, and the final race was run in conditions that made skill largely irrelevant. This randomness created drama that was both thrilling and heartbreaking. Fans never knew if their favorite driver would finish the race, win the championship, or be carried away in an ambulance. Every session carried the possibility of triumph or tragedy, making each moment precious and terrifying simultaneously. The technological legacy of 70s Formula One directly influenced modern automotive development in ways that most people never realize. The ground effects, aerodynamics, turbocharged engines, and advanced materials developed for racing eventually found their way into road cars, improving safety and performance for millions of drivers worldwide. But the human cost of this development was enormous. The drivers who died testing these technologies were essentially pioneers who sacrificed their lives to advance automotive science. Their deaths weren't meaningless, but the price paid for progress was calculated in lives lost rather than dollars spent, creating an ethical dilemma that the sport still struggles with today. The cultural impact extended far beyond motorsport, influencing fashion, music, and social attitudes toward risk and achievement. The drivers became international celebrities whose lifestyles represented a level of glamour and danger that captured public imagination in ways that modern athletes rarely achieve. As this incredible decade drew to a close, Formula One had been forever changed by the experiences of the 70s. The sport had learned hard lessons about safety, technology, and human limits that would reshape everything that followed. The drivers who survived became legends. The innovations became standards, and the memories became the foundation for modern motorsport safety protocols. The 70s proved that human beings are capable of incredible achievements when pushed to absolute limits, but also demonstrated the terrible cost of pushing too far beyond reasonable boundaries. Every modern safety regulation, every medical protocol, every technical restriction exists because someone in the 70s paid the ultimate price to teach us those lessons. Looking back at this decade, we can appreciate both the incredible courage of everyone involved and the wisdom of the changes that followed. The 70s gave us heroes, villains, innovations, and tragedies that continue to influence Formula One today, reminding us that progress often comes with a price that can't be calculated in monetary terms. These stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're reminders of how far we've come and how much we owe to the people who risked everything to advance the sport we love today. The next time you watch a modern Formula One race, remember that every safety feature, every medical facility, every emergency procedure exists because someone in the 70s experienced something that taught us how to do better. The year is 1976, and James Hunt is literally on fire during a Formula One race. But instead of stopping, he keeps driving, because that's just what drivers did back then. And if that sounds absolutely insane to you, then buckle up, because you're about to discover the most mind-blowing facts about Formula One teams in the 1,970 seconds that will make you question everything you thought you knew about motorsport. Picture this scenario for just a moment. You're hurtling down a racetrack at nearly 200 miles per hour in what is essentially a metal coffin on wheels with virtually no safety equipment whatsoever, while your car is literally catching fire around you, and your first instinct isn't to pull over and save your life, but to keep pushing because championship points are on the line. That was Formula One in the 1,970 seconds. And the teams that competed during this decade were operating under conditions that would make today's drivers absolutely refuse to even sit in the cockpit. The 1,970 seconds represented perhaps the most dangerous yet innovative period in Formula One history, where teams were constantly pushing the boundaries of what was mechanically possible, while simultaneously ignoring almost every conceivable safety protocol that we take for granted today. These weren't just racing teams. They were essentially experimental laboratories on wheels, where engineers would try the most outrageous concepts imaginable, and drivers would willingly risk their lives to test these theories at maximum speed. Let's start with perhaps the most shocking fact about 1,970 seconds. Formula One teams that most people have never heard before. The McLaren team during this decade had a secret policy that they never officially acknowledged, where they would deliberately design their cars to be slightly overweight at the beginning of each season, knowing that as the year progressed and various components wore down or were replaced with lighter materials, the car would naturally reach the minimum weight requirement by the championship's end. This meant that McLaren drivers were essentially racing with a performance handicap for the first half of every season, but the team calculated that the psychological advantage of having their cars get progressively faster as the year went on would more than compensate for the early season disadvantage. But that's absolutely nothing compared to what Team Lotus was doing during the same period under the leadership of Colin Chapman, who was quite possibly the most brilliant and reckless engineer in motorsport history. Chapman had developed a philosophy that he called controlled catastrophic failure, where he would design every single component of his Formula One cars to operate at exactly 99.9% of its maximum structural capacity. The theory was that any component that wasn't constantly on the verge of complete failure was unnecessarily heavy, and therefore slowing down the car. This approach led to Lotus cars that were incredibly fast, but also incredibly fragile, with drivers never knowing if their steering wheel might literally come off in their hands during the middle of a high-speed corner. The psychological impact of this design philosophy on Lotus drivers was absolutely fascinating from a human behavior perspective. Many drivers reported that racing for Lotus required them to develop an almost zen-like acceptance of potential mechanical failure that actually made them better drivers overall, because they learned to read the subtle signs that their car was about to break and adjust their driving style accordingly in real time. Some former Lotus drivers claimed that this experience made them so sensitive to mechanical feedback that they could predict component failures several laps before they actually occurred. Speaking of psychological warfare, the Ferrari team during the 1,970 seconds employed what might be the most ruthless driver management strategy in motorsport history. Ferrari would deliberately create intense rivalry and competition between their own drivers by providing them with slightly different car setups and then publicly comparing their performance in ways designed to maximize internal tension. The team calculated that drivers who were constantly trying to prove themselves against their own teammates would push harder and take greater risks than drivers who felt secure in their position. This strategy was incredibly effective from a performance standpoint, but it also created a toxic team environment that led to several drivers suffering what we would now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and anxiety. The most extreme example of Ferrari's psychological manipulation occurred during the 1975 season, when they told driver Clay Regazzoni that his teammate Niki Lauda was receiving superior equipment, while simultaneously telling Lauda that Regazzoni was getting the better car. Both drivers spent the entire season convinced that the team was favoring their teammate, which led them to drive with a level of desperation that produced exceptional lap times, but also resulted in numerous crashes and mechanical failures, as both drivers pushed their cars beyond reasonable limits. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of 1,970 seconds Formula One teams was their approach to safety, which can only be described as criminally negligent by today's standards. The Tyrrell team actually had a policy where they would not install safety equipment in their cars if it added more than 5 kilograms to the vehicle's weight, even if that safety equipment could potentially save a driver's life in the event of a crash. Team owner Ken Tyrrell openly stated that he believed driver safety was the driver's personal responsibility and that his job was simply to provide the fastest possible car regardless of the consequences. This cavalier attitude towards safety led to some truly horrifying incidents that most Formula One fans have never heard about. During a 1974 practice session, a Tyrrell driver experienced complete brake failure at nearly maximum speed. But instead of crashing into the barriers, he managed to aim his car toward a gravel trap while simultaneously unbuckling his safety harness and preparing to jump out of the moving vehicle. The driver actually succeeded in leaping from his car just before impact and walked away with only minor injuries. But the incident was never officially reported because the team was concerned about potential liability issues. The engineering innovations that came out of 1,970 seconds Formula One teams were absolutely mind-boggling in their creativity and complete disregard for conventional wisdom. The March engineering team developed a revolutionary aerodynamic concept they called the ground effect skirt system, where flexible panels would create a seal between the car and the track surface, allowing the vehicle to generate massive amounts of downforce through aerodynamic suction. The system was incredibly effective, but it also meant that if a driver lost the aerodynamic seal for any reason, their car would instantly lose most of its grip and become essentially uncontrollable. March engineers knew that their ground effect system was inherently dangerous, but they were so confident in its performance advantages that they decided to keep the potential risks secret from their drivers. Several March drivers crashed during the 1978 season when their ground effect seals were compromised, but they had no idea why their cars had suddenly become impossible to control. The team finally revealed the truth about their aerodynamic system only after one of their drivers threatened to quit mid-season when he realized that his car's handling characteristics were changing unpredictably from lap to time. Lap. The financial situation of 1,970 seconds Formula One teams was equally chaotic, with most organizations operating on budgets that would be considered laughably small by today's standards. The entire annual budget for the Shadow Racing team during the 1976 season was approximately equivalent to what a modern Formula One team might spend on catering for a single race weekend. This financial constraint led to incredibly creative solutions, where teams would literally manufacture their own components using whatever materials they could acquire cheaply or through barter agreements with local businesses. Shadow Racing became famous for their ability to create competitive race cars using recycled materials and components sourced from completely unrelated industries. Their 1,977 car featured brake discs that had originally been designed for industrial machinery suspension components salvaged from military vehicles, and even seat padding that had been repurposed from commercial airline seats that were being replaced. Despite this unconventional approach, Shadow Racing managed to achieve several podium finishes, and their resourcefulness became legendary within the Formula One paddock. The driver recruitment strategies employed by 1,970 seconds Formula One teams were equally unconventional, with many organizations prioritizing psychological attributes over pure driving skill. The Wolf Racing team had a policy of only hiring drivers who had demonstrated exceptional performance under extreme stress in non-motorsport situations. They actively recruited drivers who had military backgrounds or experience in other high-risk professions, believing that these individuals would be better equipped to handle the mental pressures of Formula One racing. Wolf Racing's most successful driver recruitment actually came through a completely chance encounter when team owner Walter Wolf met a former fighter pilot at a cocktail party and was impressed by the man's calm demeanor while describing a near-fatal aviation accident. Wolf offered the pilot a Formula One contract on the spot, even though the man had never driven a race car professionally. After intensive training, the former pilot became one of Wolf Racing's most consistent performers, and his military background proved invaluable in helping the team develop better communication protocols between drivers and pit crews during races. The technological espionage that occurred between Formula One teams during the 1970 seconds reads like something out of a spy novel, with organizations employing increasingly sophisticated methods to steal each other's innovations. The Brabham team hired former intelligence operatives to conduct surveillance on rival teams, and even went so far as to rent hotel rooms overlooking competitors' garage areas during race weekends so they could photograph technical developments using high-powered telephoto lenses. One of the most elaborate espionage operations in 1970 seconds Formula One involved the Ligier team's successful theft of McLaren's revolutionary suspension geometry specifications. Ligier operatives posed as journalists to gain access to the McLaren garage area and used miniature cameras hidden in fake press badges to photograph detailed technical drawings that had been left unattended for just a few minutes. The stolen information allowed Ligier to completely redesign their car's suspension system, which led to a dramatic improvement in their performance during the second half of the season. The retaliation for this technical theft was equally dramatic when McLaren discovered what had happened and decided to feed false information to Ligier through a deliberately planted double agent who pretended to be a disgruntled McLaren mechanic willing to sell secrets. The fake information led Ligier to make several costly modifications to their car that actually made it slower and less reliable, effectively neutralizing the advantage they had gained through their original espionage operation. The medical support available to Formula One drivers during the 1970 seconds was shockingly primitive, with most teams employing what can only be described as battlefield medicine approaches to treating injuries. Many teams had policies where drivers who suffered minor injuries during practice or qualifying sessions would be given powerful painkillers and expected to continue racing regardless of their physical condition. The long-term health consequences of these policies were never considered, and many drivers suffered permanent damage that could have been prevented with proper medical care. The most extreme example of medical negligence occurred during the 1977 season when a prominent Formula One driver suffered a concussion during practice, but was cleared to race after team medical staff determined that he could still remember his own name and basic driving procedures. The driver completed the entire race while suffering from what medical experts later determined was a severe head injury that should have required immediate hospitalization. The incident was kept secret for decades and only came to light when the driver began experiencing serious neurological problems in later life that were directly traced back to the inadequate medical treatment he received. The environmental impact of 1970 seconds Formula One teams was absolutely staggering, with organizations generating massive amounts of toxic waste that was often disposed of in completely inappropriate ways. Many teams would simply dump used motor oil and other hazardous materials in whatever location was most convenient without any consideration for environmental consequences. The Hesketh racing team became notorious for leaving a trail of environmental contamination at every circuit they visited, including several instances where their improper waste disposal led to local water supplies becoming contaminated with petroleum products. The most shocking environmental incident involving a 1970 seconds Formula One team occurred when the Penske organization accidentally created a toxic chemical reaction by mixing incompatible waste materials that resulted in the release of poisonous gases that forced the evacuation of an entire section of the paddock area. The incident was covered up by race organizers who were concerned about negative publicity, but several team personnel suffered respiratory problems that persisted for months afterward. The gender dynamics within 1970 seconds Formula One teams reflected the broader social attitudes of the era, with most organizations maintaining explicitly discriminatory policies that prevented women from participating in any meaningful capacity. Many teams had formal written policies stating that women were not allowed in garage areas during race weekends because their presence was considered a distraction to male team members. These policies were enforced even when the women in question were qualified engineers or mechanics whose expertise could have benefited the team's performance. The most egregious example of gender discrimination occurred when a highly qualified female engineer was hired by the Ensign team, but was prohibited from actually working on the cars and instead was assigned to purely administrative tasks. despite having more technical education than most of her male colleagues. The engineer eventually quit in frustration and later became a successful automotive designer in the civilian market, where her innovations influenced vehicle development for decades. The international political tensions of the 1970 seconds had a profound impact on Formula One teams, with many organizations becoming unwitting participants in broader geopolitical conflicts. Several teams found themselves caught in diplomatic disputes when their sponsors had business relationships with countries that were experiencing political upheaval. The most dramatic example occurred when the UOP Shadow team discovered that one of their major financial backers was actually a front organization for a foreign intelligence service that was using Formula One access as cover for espionage activities. The revelation that Formula One teams were being infiltrated by intelligence operatives led to a series of investigations that uncovered a complex web of international intrigue involving multiple teams and sponsors. Several prominent team personnel were quietly removed from their positions after background checks revealed suspicious connections to various government agencies. The full extent of intelligence service involvement in 1970 seconds, Formula One remains classified, but former team members have suggested that the infiltration was far more extensive than was ever publicly acknowledged. The technological legacy of 1970 seconds Formula One teams extends far beyond motorsport, with many innovations developed during this period, eventually finding their way into civilian automotive applications. The advanced materials research conducted by teams like Lotus and McLaren contributed to the development of lightweight composites that are now standard in everything from commercial aircraft to consumer electronics. The aerodynamic principles discovered through Formula One experimentation influenced the design of everything from high-speed trains to wind turbine blades. Perhaps most significantly, the safety innovations that eventually emerged from the tragic accidents of the 1970 seconds led to revolutionary improvements in automotive safety technology that have saved countless lives in civilian applications. The energy-absorbing structures developed for Formula One cars became the foundation for modern automotive crumple zones, while the fire suppression systems, created for racing applications, evolved into standard safety equipment for inclined, commercial and military vehicles. The human cost of 1970 seconds. Formula One cannot be overlooked, with the decade producing some of the most tragic losses in motorsport history, but also some of the most inspiring examples of human courage and determination. The drivers who competed during this era knew that they were risking their lives every time they got behind the wheel, but they continued to push the boundaries of what was possible because they believed they were contributing to something larger than themselves. The teams of the 1970 seconds created a legacy that continues to influence Formula One today, even as the sport has evolved into a much safer and more technologically sophisticated competition. The spirit of innovation and willingness to take risks that characterized this era remains an essential part of Formula One's identity, and the lessons learned during this dangerous but transformative decade continue to shape how modern teams approach the challenges of competitive motorsport. As we look back on this incredible period in Formula One history, it's important to remember that behind every shocking statistic and outrageous anecdote were real people who dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of what was possible in motorsport. Their willingness to take enormous risks in pursuit of speed and victory created the foundation for everything we love about Formula One today, and their legacy continues to inspire new generations of drivers, engineers, and fans who share anyways to 110-1. Their passion for racing at the absolute limit of human and mechanical capability. The 1970 seconds taught Formula One that progress often comes at a tremendous cost, but that the pursuit of excellence requires a willingness to venture into unknown territory, regardless of the potential consequences, and that lesson remains just as relevant today as it was 50 years ago, when brave men and women were literally playing with fire in their quest to go faster than anyone had ever gone before.